Next on the agenda, we have our keynote speaker, Dr. Alissa Trotz. Dr. Trotz is a mother to a son and two daughters. She is professor of Caribbean Studies at the New College and the director of Women and Gender Studies at the University of Toronto. She's also affiliate faculty at the Dame Nita Barrow Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, Cape Campus, Barbados. And she's a gender expert on Gender Mainstreaming Committee of the West Indies, the University of the West Indies. Most recently, she is editor of The Point is to Change the World, Selected Writings by Andaiye, which is a Pluto Press Black Critique series in 2022, with a Portuguese translation being released later this month by a Brazilian publisher. Dr. Alissa Trotz is an overseas resource member of the Red Thread, which is a grassroots women's organization in Guyana. And for the last 15 years, she has edited in the Diaspora, which is a weekly newspaper column in the Guyanese daily Stabroek News. So give a warm welcome to Dr. Alissa Trotz.
Thank you so much for, everyone can hear me? Yes, great. Thank you so much for that warm introduction and welcome, Renice. All protocols having been observed. Good evening to everyone. I'm joining you today from Toronto, where I'm grateful for, I'm just setting my stopwatch. Yeah, where I'm grateful for the opportunity to live and work on the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Barbados actually is a second home to me in so many ways. My father made this country his home for about 8 years, and I have a long-standing relationship with the University of the West Indies. So I'm really delighted and truly honored to be among you, if only virtually tonight. So I'd like to congratulate the Pink Parliament for this really important initiative now in its 4th cycle, work that deservedly saw you honored last year with the Civicus Nelson Mandela Graça Machel Innovation Award for your contributions to democratizing governance systems and processes. Thank you for inviting me to say a few words. And let me take this opportunity to congratulate this year's cohort, the class of 2023, which gathers under the visionary theme, Girls Can Lead, Redefining Leadership. And it was wonderful to hear the impressive speeches. I was like, y'all don't need to hear from me, by Ayana and Sade, Donalisa and Guyza. Thank you so much for those inspiring words. But I want to especially shout out Life in Leggings tonight, which is the force behind Pink Parliament. And I'll come back to this later because it's movements that keep things going. It's movements that return us to what matters. It's movements that make change. And as you begin this journey, the most important lesson, I hope, is that you never forget that. The objectives of Pink Parliament, quote, to inspire and encourage young women to pursue careers in politics, and quote, to increase the participation of women in politics by providing participants with access to a network of dynamic women, end quote, are urgent and necessary. When we look at the fact that in the Caribbean right now, we can point to just one female Prime Minister, your own Mia Amor Motley, among 4 others, Prime Minister Eugenia Charles of Dominica, President Janet Jagan of Guyana, Prime Minister Kamala Besessar of Trinidad and Tobago, and Prime Minister Portia Simpson of Jamaica. You stand on the shoulders of women like Muriel Nellie Weeks, the first woman to contest a seat for the House of Assembly on your island, Dame Edna Bourne, the first woman to be elected as a member of the House of this Assembly, women like Dame Nita Barrow and Dame Billy Miller with extensive experience in national politics, but on the international stage as well. And you also build upon and extend the work of others who have gone before you, like the 51% Coalition in Jamaica, like the National Organization of Women in Barbados, Caribbean Women in Leadership, the Housewives Association of Trinidad and Tobago, and so many more. But what I find beautiful about your own initiative is how girl-centered it is, how it underlines the importance of youth and the new generations. It is important to recognize that the underrepresentation of women in parliament and in politics, despite the fact that women represent 50% and in some cases even more of the population, despite the long history of female-headed households in the region, this underrepresentation does not mean that women have not been involved all the way through. Women's presence, energies, commitments, sacrifices were absolutely central to the success of the anti-colonial struggles, which gave so many of our countries independence and the opportunity to run our own affairs. And yet, women were excluded, with leadership in public affairs and matters of the state assumed to be the business of men. Not European men anymore, but still men, what Trinidadian economist Lloyd Best might well call an exchange and not a real change. In an essay in her co-authored book on gender policy and politics in the Caribbean, Dr. Gabrielle Hussein has a telling quote from former Jamaican politician Maxine Henry Wilson that explicitly and disturbingly names some of the gender challenges of getting involved in public political life. And it's something that Ronelle opened today with, talking about those difficulties. So the quote is, "The conduct of politics is very male in its orientation. For example, most of it is done on a Sunday. Women's domestic lives invariably suffer while they're attending to political matters on a Sunday. The campaign trail is rigorous, almost to the point of being dangerous. After a while, you begin to wonder, well, is this what I really want to do? The norms of the campaign trail sometimes embody experiences and behaviors that are not seen as feminine. I remember there was a case of a woman who did what all men did, which was go to the bar and drink. And then it was used against her in the campaign. There are cases where you hear of women being described as very loose and therefore that you should not support them," end quote. And that's from a former Jamaican politician. And I was just thinking about that when Sade was speaking with you tonight and talking about, the same kinds of challenges in Barbados and asking you to think about the way in which the media responds differently to female and male politicians. An Indigenous woman from Guyana said a few weeks ago that in her village, her Tishao is an Indigenous leader, but her Tishao, who happened to be a woman, said that you had to put on the bush cow's skin. The bush cow, which is also known as a tapir, is this animal that has a very tough hide. So she said to Margaret, you have to put on your bush cow's skin if you want to get involved in public-facing work. And this quote from Henry Wilson and Sade's remarks just give us a good sense of how difficult that work can be. So I want to suggest that really understanding these challenges requires work in three directions. And the late Barbadian novelist George Lamming offered this proverb: the donkey works, but the horse gets promoted. The donkey works, but the horse gets promoted. So the first bit of work is that you have to make visible what the donkey does, make visible the stories of all those women who made change happen. And one person who I want to mention this evening is Hazel Brown, who was an absolutely incredible local and regional activist from Trinidad and Tobago who died a few weeks ago. Her life is an example to us all. And I would urge Pink parliamentarians to go and find out what you can about Hazel and what she did for the Caribbean, including advocating for higher levels of women's political participation. The second bit of work is to ask what happened to narrow that broad participation of women. How did they get shut out? Those women without whom the political landscape would never have been changed. And thirdly, to examine what the experiences of others tell you about the challenges to expect when the status quo is threatened, and about how to find strength in community as you navigate these obstacles. But, and for me, this is also key, it's never just about getting women into political office or parliament. The rise to prominence of the far right in several European countries, in parties that are increasingly xenophobic, some of them that even have roots to neo-Nazi organizations. So the rise to prominence of the far right and the women who play leading roles in many of these far right parties, whether it's Giorgia Meloni in Italy or Marine Le Pen in France, should actually make us pause and reflect on the difference between numerical representation, which is just increasing numbers of women, and substantive representation, which is really about changing things, about the difference that really makes a difference. And I know that last year's speaker, Professor Udine Barreto, addressed this in her remarks when she called on Pink parliamentarians not to divert your attention from dealing with, quote, the ongoing struggles of the vast majority of women who are struggling to make a living. And I loved how Donna Lisa, in her reflections this evening, thought about that in her comments about accessibility and the arts, right? So the difference that can make a difference. And that line is actually a line that I borrow from Angela Davis in a talk where she's talking about trying to think about all of the complex ways in which we come to understand ourselves as gendered subjects. And research across the region, coordinated by Gabrielle Hussein and Jane Parpert, found soberingly that an adversarial winner-take-all Westminster political system in the Caribbean makes it really difficult for women and men and others to work across the political aisle on gender issues, or to publicly stand up against misogyny or homophobia, for example, in their own political parties. In some fundamental respects, in fact, I actually think that Westminsterism is a colonial legacy that hangs around the neck of the Caribbean. We're way too small, we're way too intimate. And yet we continue to grapple with the imposition of a political system that makes us strangers from each other. That is a much bigger and more careful conversation to be had. But perhaps for you, Pink parliamentarians, part of your own work is to focus on what it means to meet each other across difference of political loyalty, of sexuality, of ideology, of age, of class, of race, what it means to meet across difference, to build something together. This is never easy work. It's never free of tensions. It's full of disagreements. Everyone will make mistakes, but you're all together stronger because the time and the effort and the labor has been taken to build connections between yourselves, to work through, to listen to, and to see each other's fears and insecurities, instead of deepening those insecurities to build walls that separate us. It is a capacity that we must practice always. And what I've been talking about tonight is kind of like, a funnel. You have all this energy, all this vitality, all of these women participating, and then it gets narrower and narrower, and only a few pass through. And I think we have to guard against this. And one of my own mentors, who's a Trinidadian feminist by the name of Jackie Alexander, asked these 4 questions, which for me are everything and which I want to offer to the Pink parliamentarians today. 1, who are you? 2, why did you come? 3, are you doing the work you came here to do? And 4, who walks with you? We each have to do that work to figure those answers to Jackie's questions out for ourselves. It's not work that ever ends either, by the way. But let me come back to this question of movement and suggest that one of those walking with you is Life in Leggings, the Caribbean Alliance Against Gender-Based Violence. It was that brave decision of young women back in 2016, at the time I think it was Ronelle and Alison Ben, to create the hashtag Life in Leggings and offer a space for first-person testimonies that forced a public conversation on sexual harassment and sexual violence right across the Caribbean, insisting that these were issues that matter. I was actually telling students at the University of Guyana just last week about the fact that in 2020, some 50 women were killed in Trinidad and Tobago as a result of gender-based violence. Between February and October of just this year, close to 12 women had already lost their lives in Guyana. In Puerto Rico, the governor declared a state of emergency in relation to gender-based violence about 2 years ago. But crucially, Life in Leggings got picked up across the region and even in the diaspora, and it would move offline the following year, when in March 2017, in commemoration of International Women's Day, organizations and individuals took to the streets in 6 Caribbean countries. I think it was meant to be 7, but Dominica had a flood and so couldn't participate. But they took to the streets in a coordinated series of women-led and survivor-centered solidarity marches and demonstrations. In the Bahamas, there were speeches on the women's suffrage movement, on the significance of women's participation in the formal political process. There were solicitations of assistance for survivors of a recent fire in the country's capital. There was art therapy and self-defense workshops. In Guyana, activists called for accessible reproductive healthcare, for comprehensive sex education, something Guyza spoke about in her presentation tonight, and for LGBTQ rights, while actions in Trinidad and Tobago emphasized issues of consent and of women's economic empowerment. The largest gathering that brought thousands of people into the streets took place in Jamaica and was organized by the Tambourine Army, which was formed after a group coming out of women's and queer activist circles decided to take collective action following reports of the sexual abuse of women and girls by religious leaders, young people who were just plain fed up with laws that seemed to protect the powerful and with a legal system that still could not deliver justice. Remember that these were primarily young women and girls, just like all of you, taking the lead, refusing to small up themselves, insisting on taking up space, courageously putting themselves and their bodies out there. And going public with your stories of harassment and violence is no small feat, especially in the era of social media, with its capacity to amplify things in ways that can be empowering, but also devastatingly violent. These young people forced a conversation about sexual violence onto the local and regional agenda. And this is what leadership looks like. And we must always keep returning to the source, to the work that made everything else possible, the conversations that then saw connections across gender and sexual and economic violence, that made links between violence and marginalization, that recognized that to do something, questions of political power had to be tackled. This was the condition of possibility for Pink Parliament, which brings you together today. And I want to remind you to hold on to that as you identify and resist any efforts to narrow your own aspirations. So look for inspiration among your ancestors and elders, and also find it in the incredible instances of girls and young women standing up and speaking truth to power right now, which certainly gives me hope in these difficult times, what in Guyana we would describe as the hard guava season. There are so many examples all around us. I find myself these days waking up in the mornings and going in search of the Iranian schoolgirls who are refusing to be silent following the brutal death in police custody of 22-year-old Kurdish student Mahsa Amini, taking to the streets, putting their bodies on the line with the slogan, "Women, Life, Freedom," even in the face of ongoing state repression and violence, and the killing since then of 16-year-old Nika Shakrami and 16-year-old Serena Ismailzadeh. This is what courage looks like. I find myself thinking about the young girls and women on the front lines of environmental activism in this time of existential crisis, with regions like ours particularly vulnerable and under threat. Names like Severn Cullis-Suzuki from Canada, who attended and addressed the United Nations Climate Conference in Rio de Janeiro 30 years ago, a few years after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established, and she was just 12 years old at the time. Today, others like Vanessa Nakate of Uganda, Greta Thunberg of Sweden, the school children walking out of school all over the world are leading the fight for climate justice. This is what vision looks like. I'm thinking about right here in our own hemisphere, folks like Marielle Franco, the Black queer Brazilian politician, human rights defender, councilwoman who was viciously assassinated in 2018 by those who did not think her voice should be heard, and those who follow her who are not backing down. And we just saw this in the first round of the Brazilian elections, where the first trans woman has been elected to Congress, as well as in the indigenous women and social movement leaders. Or in Colombia, where Francia Marquez has become the country's first Afro-descendant vice president, a woman whose public life began at the age of 13 when she challenged the building of a dam in her community. Or the young women and genderqueer activists across Latin America who have made femicide, the starting point of their activism, but who do not stop there, who are pushing us to make connections between violence against women, violence against children, and the wider violence of societies like ours, organized around extractive, non-sustainable, and deeply exploitative relationships with the land and with more than human life. These young people are pushing for the most fundamental conversations of all, challenging us to imagine a world in which, as George Lamming has said, our relations with each other and with all living things is revolutionized, driven not by profit, but by principles and values of care. This is a commitment to transformation, not just tinkering at the margins. It's more than just demanding a seat at the table. It's asking questions about whether that's the damn table we want to be at in the first place. And Pink parliamentarians, it begins with you, but it touches everyone. As Guyanese social activist Andaiye has said, quote, "You can begin organizing at any point. If you do it right, it will lead you to every other point." So in closing, let me return to your theme, girls can lead, redefining leadership. So I'm a teacher, right? If this were a class, I would have you all in here for like 2 hours, taking apart just those 5 words, putting that sentence back together, studying each word, taking your time and care with taking care of that sentence. I should emphasize that's also a political practice of taking time and care with what you say and what you put out in the world. For me, those 5 words are a statement full of confidence in the bold-faced capacity of girls and young women to step up and take the reins to organize. Girls can lead. It says to us not only that it is possible, girls can lead, but that there are examples, rich histories, and wellsprings of experience to draw from. It's a statement that tells us of the work to be done. It suggests that the involvement of girls offers opportunities to challenge what leadership is, what it consists of, what it looks like. And just your very presence, know this, just your very presence calls into question traditional understandings of who is a leader. And it serves crucially it serves crucially to remind us that redefining leadership is a continual challenge. It is therefore a call for us to keep questioning that critical thinking that Ayana referred to in her comments tonight, to never feel or act as if you have arrived or as if you have all the answers. You know, years ago, someone shared with me a remarkable and hilarious insight from your own mighty Gabby, that Calypsonian and griot. And it was along the lines, and I'm paraphrasing here, and he said, you see the Prime Minister face on the front page of the morning newspaper? By nighttime, that same front page wrapping up the fresh fish that say Miss Boston taking down to Baxter Road for the fish fry. I love that aphorism. I've shared it so many times because it's a perfect reminder that humility counts, never leading from ego, working always not to center the I or the me. And through the figure of Miss Boston, that fish fry lady that Gabby invokes, it shows us where the real value, the life-giving sustenance that we rely upon comes from, to whom we are answerable and accountable. I want to suggest that this is the real lesson of politics and power for you as you set out upon this work with your cohort, with 4 generations of graduates from the Pink Parliament, and with all of the incredible mentors that you will be meeting, working with, learning from, and also teaching over the next months. Huge congratulations to you. And please remember the joy and the fun in this work as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alissa Trotz. That was quite a moving speech. I feel very empowered listening to it myself. And I think that your speech was very cross-sectional. And I think that I touched on a lot of different topics that I myself would have heard while I was in Pink Parliament and I've subsequently been in touch with. So thank you so much. Yes, Don Lisa's in the chat, giving a little bit of applause.